A Thursday evening. Rain against the windows of a building that did not exist on any map the city kept, where decisions were settled before the rest of the world knew they were being made. Inside, the most feared name in 3 territories sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by men who had spent their lives learning how to be dangerous, and not one of them could solve the problem in front of them. A recording played from a device at the center of the table. 2 voices speaking in something none of the 12 translators brought in over the past 2 weeks had been able to identify. Not Russian, not Georgian, not Turkish, not Chechen. Something older. Something from a place most maps had stopped naming a long time ago. Torin had listened to it over 40 times, and the words still meant nothing. But the tone, the urgency, the way one voice dropped and the other responded like a warning that he understood. Something was coming. Something that recording would explain if anyone in this city could unlock it. The door at the back opened and no one looked up. Deliveries came through that entrance every evening. The woman who carried the crates in was unremarkable in every deliberate way. Plain jacket, hair pulled back under a cap, a presence built to be forgotten the moment it left a room. She set the first crate on the counter near the wall. Then the second. The recording played on. One of his men rewound it to the section that had been circled, analyzed, and played for every language specialist they could find. The voice on the recording spoke again, sharp, clipped, ending with a word repeated 3 times, each repetition more urgent than the last. The delivery woman stopped moving. Her hands still rested on the crate, but her body had gone rigid, not startled, not curious. Still, the way a person goes still when they hear something that belongs to a life they sealed shut a long time ago. No one noticed at first. Then she whispered the next line before the recording spoke it. Not a guess. Not something close. The exact words, in the exact dialect, with a fluency that does not come from study. It comes from birth. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Every head turned toward the woman in the plain jacket who had just spoken a language worth more than anything else on that table. Torin did not move. His eyes found her before his body could react, and for a handful of seconds, nothing existed except the distance between him and the woman who had just whispered words his entire operation had been bleeding to understand. She felt it, the weight of every gaze. Color drained from her face. Her hands released the crate in a way that did not match the panic behind her eyes. She stepped back, 1 step, then another. Wait. His voice was not loud. It never needed to be. In rooms like this, it carried the way gravity carries weight. She did not wait. She pushed through the door and vanished into the rain. Torin stood slowly. The room held its breath. Find her. 2 words. No one asked questions, but it was Cassell, the man who had stood at his right for over a decade, who spoke first. She works for the courier service on Harwick. We can have her file in under an hour. I do not want her file. Torin's voice dropped, which made it worse. I want to know who she is. There was a difference. Everyone understood it. 2 hours later, he stood in a hallway that did not belong in the same sentence as his name. 4th floor, apartment 7, a building where the walls carried years no one had bothered to cover. This was where people lived when they did not want to be found. He knocked once. Silence. Then movement. Measured. Deliberate. The sound of someone who had learned to approach doors the way you approach things that might be dangerous. A lock turned. The door opened on a chain. A child's face appeared in the gap. A girl, no older than 4, with dark curly hair and wide, watchful eyes that studied him without blinking. She held a stuffed rabbit by one ear, its fabric worn thin from years of being gripped too tightly. "Mama," she called over her shoulder. "There is a man." Footsteps. Then she was there. The delivery woman, filling the space behind the child, one hand pulling the girl gently back, the other gripping the edge of the door with knuckles that had gone white. "You need to leave." Calm. Controlled. The same voice that had spoken a dead language in a room full of dangerous men 2 hours ago, but underneath it now, something sharper. Something cornered. "I need to understand what happened tonight." "Nothing happened. I delivered food." The girl peeked around her mother's hip. "Mama, why does he look like that?" "Like what, love?" "Like he is looking for someone who is not here." The words landed somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he did not know was still unguarded. Her arms tightened around the girl. "He is not looking for anyone. He came to the wrong door." But as she moved to close the gap, his eyes caught something behind her. A photograph on the wall, half hidden by a coat on a hook. A man. Dark hair, sharp jaw, a thin scar along the left temple. His body went still. Not the stillness of decision, the stillness of recognition arriving without permission. Demian. The name surfaced like something dragged from deep water, carrying a weight that had no business being in this hallway, in this building, in this life. She saw it. The exact second his expression changed, and everything about her shifted. The calm fractured. The control thinned. What replaced it was not fear. It was the focused, desperate clarity of someone whose invisibility had just been stripped away by a single glance at a photograph. The door slammed. The chain rattled. The lock turned once, then twice. Inside, the girl's voice came through the walls. Small. Confused. "Mama, why are you shaking?" A pause. Then her voice, barely a whisper. "I am not shaking, love. I am just cold." He did not knock again. He lowered himself to the hallway floor, back against the opposite wall, eyes fixed on the closed door between him and a truth he was only beginning to understand. Because this was no longer about a recording, or a deal, or a language no one could decode. This was about a man named Demian, a debt that was never paid, and a woman who should never have been left to disappear alone. And for the first time in a life built on commands and control, the man who never waited for anyone chose to sit and stay. I grew up in a house where language was the only inheritance anyone had left to give. My grandmother spoke the old tongue of the Velhari Ridge, a dialect that existed nowhere in print, nowhere on any record, only in the mouths of people born high enough in the mountains that the rest of the world forgot to reach them. She taught it to me the way she taught me everything. Slowly, patiently, sitting on the stone step behind our home while the valley turned gold in the evening light. By the time I was 16, I spoke 6 languages. By 20, I had a place at the university in the capital, and a scholarship that felt like a door opening onto a life my mother had only ever dreamed about. That was where I met Demian. He was older by a few years, studying something vague that he described differently depending on who asked. Trade policy one day, logistics consulting the next, always smiling in a way that made the inconsistency feel charming rather than suspicious. He had a presence about him, warm, steady, like a man who had already figured out where the world was heading and was content to walk there at his own pace. I fell in love with him the way you fall into something you do not see coming, not all at once, over conversations that stretched too long, over walks through the city at hours that should have sent me home, over the way he listened when I talked about languages like they mattered, like I mattered, like the thing I carried inside me was not strange or academic but beautiful. We married in the spring. Small ceremony. His family was distant, scattered, hard to reach. I did not question it. Some families are like that. Mine was gone except for my grandmother, and she was too frail to travel. So it was just us, standing in a borrowed garden, promising things I believed with everything I had. The apartment he found was beautiful. 3 rooms on the 6th floor with windows that let in light that made even ordinary mornings feel important. He filled it with small things I never asked for. Books I mentioned once that appeared on the nightstand a week later. Flowers on the table every Friday without exception. A quiet, steady consistency that built something I had never known before. Safety. When Leora was born, the world became even smaller and even more complete. She arrived in the early hours of a Tuesday, loud and immediate, with dark curls and eyes that opened right away, like she had plans for this world and refused to waste a single moment. Demian held her like she was made of glass, his face so open, so unguarded, that I remember thinking I had never seen anyone look that fragile and that strong at the same time. Those first months were everything. Messy and exhausting and so full of love that I forgot to look at anything else. I forgot to wonder why his phone rang at hours that did not belong to ordinary work. I forgot to ask why some weeks were generous with money and others required counting. I forgot to notice the way he came home on certain evenings with a tension in his shoulders that he never explained, and I never pressed him on. I trusted him. That was the foundation of everything. Trust in his voice when he told me it was fine. Trust in the way he looked at me when the world felt too heavy. Trust in the version of him I had chosen to believe in, because the alternative was something I could not afford to consider. Our apartment smelled of coffee in the mornings and lavender at night. Leora grew into her voice, into her curiosity, into a child who asked questions about everything and accepted nothing without turning it over twice. She was his in temperament and mine in stubbornness, and together we built something that felt permanent. That was my mistake. Not loving him, not trusting him, but believing that anything built on someone else's silence could last. Because silence is not the same as peace. It is architecture. And every piece of architecture has a blueprint, and every blueprint has an author. I just did not know yet who had drawn ours. It began with a favor. That was what made it so easy to miss. Demian came home one evening with a folder tucked under his arm and a smile that looked the same as every other smile he had ever given me. Warm, easy. The sort of expression that made you believe the world was smaller and safer than it actually was. "I need your help with something," he said, setting the folder on the kitchen table while Leora banged a wooden spoon against a pot on the floor beside us. A client sent documents in a dialect no one at the firm can read. My supervisor thinks it might be from the Eastern Ridge region. Something old. He said it the way you ask someone to pass the salt, and I did not hesitate. Why would I? Languages were the one thing I had that no one could take, or buy, or imitate. So I opened the folder and I started reading. The text was handwritten, cramped, written by someone whose hand was either rushed or afraid. It was in Vilhari, my grandmother's tongue, the dialect I carried inside me like a second pulse. No one outside a few thousand people in the mountain villages could have read a single line. I translated it in under an hour. Sitting at that same kitchen table while Leora slept in her chair and Demian made tea, and the apartment felt like the safest place in the world. Names, dates, routes traced through mountain passes I recognized from childhood. Quantities I did not understand at first but would learn later were weights, shipments, human ones. I did not know that then. I handed the translated pages back to him and he kissed my forehead and said thank you, like I had just helped with a household errand. And I believed it, because belief was what I did best. 3 more folders came over the next month, each one in the same dialect, each one longer, more detailed, harder to explain if I had been paying close attention, but I was not paying attention. I was a mother, a wife, a woman who translated pages and did not ask where they came from because the man who brought them home had never given me reason to doubt him. The night it shattered was the quietest night I can remember. Leora was sleeping. Demian was working late. I went to his desk to find an envelope for a letter I was sending to my grandmother, and the drawer caught on something wedged in the back. A second folder, thicker, sealed with tape, marked in a hand I did not recognize. I opened it because I had no reason not to. Inside were the same documents I had translated, but beside them sat others I had never seen. Charts, payment records, names I recognized from the news, people who had vanished from the eastern villages. And next to every translated page, in neat writing that was not my husband's, there were notes, instructions, schedules built on information only my translations could have provided. Everything I had given him had been used. Every name, every route, every detail my grandmother's language had carried across those pages had been turned into a tool for something I could not hold in my hands without feeling the floor tilt beneath me. I sat in that chair for a long time. The apartment was perfectly still. The light above the desk buzzed faintly. Somewhere below us, a neighbor's television murmured through the floor. And inside my chest, the structure of everything I had believed was collapsing, beam by beam, in a silence so total I could hear my own heartbeat slow, as though my body was deciding whether it still wanted to keep going. He had used me, not with cruelty, not with force, with trust. He had taken the one thing that was truly mine, the language my grandmother placed in my mouth like an inheritance no one could steal, and he had turned it into a mechanism for something I could not say aloud without feeling sick. I should have confronted him. I should have screamed, thrown the folder across the room, demanded answers loud enough to wake our daughter and the entire building. But I did none of that. I closed the folder. I returned it to the drawer. I sealed it shut. And I sat there in the dark, listening to Leora breathing in the next room, understanding for the first time that the life I had been living had never been the life I believed it was. The man I loved had built our home on a fault line. And now I could feel the ground beginning to shift beneath everything we had made together. But the collapse had not arrived yet. That would come 3 days later, in the hours before dawn, when the men in dark coats came for what Demian owed them. And the only thing standing between my daughter and the world her father had been hiding behind his smile was a woman who had just learned she had been used as a weapon without ever knowing she was loaded. They came on a Monday, 3 days after I found the folder. 3 days I spent not sleeping, barely eating, thinking about nothing except the distance between my daughter's crib and the nearest exit. I had packed a bag. Not large, not obvious. A backpack tucked behind the washing machine where Demian would never think to look. Inside it, cash I had withdrawn in small amounts over those 3 days, a change of clothes for both of us, Leora's ear medicine, my grandmother's ring, a photograph of my mother, and one of Demian that Leora kept propped beside her crib, the only image of her father she had ever known. The sound that woke me was not loud. That was what made it terrifying. A lock being turned by someone who had a key, then a second lock, opened with something that was not a key at all. 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3, moving with a quiet that belongs to people who have entered rooms like this before. Demian was in the living room. I heard his voice first, low and steady, the tone of a man who understood exactly what was standing in front of him and was trying to calculate his way past it. I could not hear the words, only the rhythm, the way it rose slightly, then leveled, then rose again, bargaining with something that did not want to negotiate. Then a sound I will carry for the rest of my life. Short, final. Something that ends a conversation and everything attached to it. I did not scream. I did not freeze. Something inside me had been preparing for this since the night I opened that drawer, and it moved before my mind could catch up. I lifted Leora from her crib. She stirred, her small body tensing, a sound building in her throat that would have become a cry if I had not pressed my lips to her ear and whispered the only thing I knew would quiet her. The old words, the ones my grandmother sang on winter mornings when the valley was buried in snow. Vilhari, the language that had started all of this. She went still, not quiet from fear, quiet from recognition. Those sounds meant safety to her. They meant me. I moved through the apartment without turning on a single light. The backpack was where I left it. The bathroom window opened onto a fire escape that dropped into the alley behind the building. I had tested it twice in the dark over those 3 days, memorizing every rung, every drop, and every angle of the railing where it met the wall. Leora clung to me, her face pressed into my neck, her fingers gripping my shirt with a strength that should not have been possible for hands that small. I climbed down with one arm and held her with the other, every muscle burning, every second stretched so thin it felt like the air itself was trying to slow me down. The alley was empty, cold, smelling of rain that had passed hours ago and trash that no one had collected. I moved fast, staying close to walls, turning corners without looking back, because looking back meant seeing the building where my husband was no longer alive, and I could not afford to feel that yet. I walked for hours, through streets I did not recognize, past buildings that meant nothing, into parts of the city where the lights thinned and the silence grew heavier. Leora slept against my chest, her breath warm and steady, trusting me completely in a way that made me want to collapse under the weight of what that trust demanded. By morning, I was on a bus heading east. I did not choose the direction. I chose the first departure, leaving within the hour. The seat smelled of diesel and old fabric. A woman across the aisle looked at Leora, then at me, then turned away without asking a thing. I stared out the window as the city shrank behind us. Buildings giving way to flat land, then fields, then nothing. Demian was dead. I knew it the way you know something your body understood before your mind allowed it through. The sound I heard through the wall had left no room for anything else, and sitting there, holding my daughter, watching everything I had known disappear behind dirty glass, I understood something that settled into me like cold water filling a cracked vessel. The language in my head was not a gift anymore. It was evidence. It was a weapon. It was the reason those men came, and it was the reason they would keep looking until they found the person who could read what no one else could. I was that person. And the only thing protecting my daughter from the world that killed her father was the fact that no one knew my face. I intended to keep it that way. The city I chose was not beautiful. That was why I chose it. Granist sat on the coast like something the sea had pushed inland and forgotten to reclaim. Industrial in the places that mattered, worn down in the places that did not. Large enough that a woman and a child could disappear into its grid without anyone wondering where they came from or why. I arrived with a backpack and a daughter who had not stopped gripping my hand since we left the bus. I found a room first. A studio above a laundromat on Kelter Street, small enough that the bed and the kitchen shared the same wall. The windows faced a brick building across the alley, letting in just enough light to tell morning from afternoon. The landlord took cash. No lease, no questions. He looked at Leora once, then at me, and nodded like he had seen this before, and knew better than to ask. I found work within the week. A courier service operating out of a converted garage on Harwick, run by a woman named Hajna who had forearms like dock rope and a voice that expected results, not explanations. She looked at me the same way the landlord had. One long glance that measured everything and commented on nothing. You can drive. Yes. You show up on time? Yes. Start tomorrow. 5 in the morning. Do not be late. I was not late. Not once in 3 years. I loaded crates, drove routes that crossed the city and back, carried packages into buildings that ranged from polished offices to places that smelled exactly like the hallway outside my apartment. I kept my head low, my voice level, my presence as small and forgettable as I could make it. To the people I delivered to, I was no one. A jacket, a cap, a signature on a clipboard. Exactly what I needed to be. Leora adapted the way children do, with a speed that felt like both a blessing and a reproach. She found the cracks in our new life and filled them with things that belonged to her. A drawing taped to the window, a name for the stray cat that sat on the fire escape every evening, a friendship with the woman who ran the grocery downstairs, who slipped her crackers when she thought I was not watching. She stopped asking about her father after the first month, not because she forgot, because she sensed, in the way children sense everything that matters, that the answer would cost me something I could not afford to spend. At night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the dark and listened. To the laundromat humming beneath us, to the street settling into whatever quiet it could manage, to my own breathing, steady, deliberate, each exhale a small proof that we had survived another day without being found. I buried the old language deep. I did not speak it. I did not think in it. I scrubbed it from my daily life like a stain that might betray us if anyone looked too closely. Vilhari became something I sealed in a room inside my mind and refused to open. But languages do not work that way. They do not stay where you put them. They rise in dreams, in the soft sounds you make when you are not guarding your mouth, in the rhythm of your breathing when sleep strips away every wall you spent the day building. And they pass, quietly and without permission, to the ones who listen most carefully. Leora spoke her first Velhari word on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I was chopping onions in the kitchen. She was sitting on the floor with a coloring book, humming something tuneless the way she always did when she was concentrating. Then she said it. Clear, precise, perfectly accented, as though she had been holding it in her mouth for months and only just decided to let it go. Dravaya. The knife stopped. My hand went still. The word meant safe place in my grandmother's dialect. Not something a child picks up from school or a screen. Something she could only have absorbed from one source. Me. I turned slowly. Where did you hear that? She looked up without concern, marker still in hand. You say it. When you think I am sleeping, you whisper it. The floor shifted beneath me. Not physically. Something structural. Something that had been holding everything in place. I had been so vigilant. Years of silence, of scrubbing the language from every waking hour, of never speaking it where anyone could hear. And none of it mattered, because the language had found the one listener I could not guard against. My own daughter, lying awake in the dark, memorizing the sounds her mother made when she thought no one was listening. I knelt in front of her and took her hands. Leora, listen to me. Those words, the ones you hear me say at night, they are our secret. Only ours. You cannot say them outside this apartment. Not to friends, not to teachers, not to anyone. Do you understand? She searched my face with those wide, intent eyes that had always seen more than a child her age should. Are they dangerous words, Mama? I almost broke. Almost let everything I had been carrying crack through the surface and spill onto the floor between us. But mothers do not have that luxury. Not the ones who are hiding. They are precious words, I said instead, and precious things need to be protected. She nodded, serious, accepting it the way she accepted everything I asked of her, with a faith that frightened me more than any threat ever had. Because her faith meant she trusted me to keep us safe, and I was not certain I could. That same week, I heard the broadcast. The small television in Hajna's office was usually tuned to weather and local traffic. Background noise no one listened to. But that morning, before my shift started, a national report cut through. A journalist standing outside a government building, talking about an investigation into trafficking networks operating through the eastern mountain regions. Documents had been recovered. Arrests were being made. But there was a gap in the case, a critical piece of evidence, translated from an unidentified regional dialect, had surfaced among seized files. The original translator remained unknown. Authorities and other interested parties were actively seeking this individual, believed to be a woman living under an assumed name. The journalist used the word translator 4 times in 90 seconds. I stood in front of that screen and felt every wall I had built thin to paper. It was not just the men who killed Demian anymore. The search had widened. Governments were involved now. Investigators with resources that made the men in dark coats look like shadows, and behind them all, still patient, still present, the organization that needed the translator silenced permanently because what I carried in my head could dismantle every route, every connection, every name they had spent decades building. I walked out of Hajna's office and sat in the delivery van for 20 minutes without starting the engine. My hands would not stop shaking, not from fear alone, from recognition. The cage had just gotten smaller. I could run again. Pack the backpack, pull Leora from her school, board another bus heading somewhere new. But she was 4 now. She had a teacher she loved, a drawing pinned to her classroom wall, a cat she fed every evening on the fire escape. Tearing her from this life would break something inside her that I might never be able to repair. And running with a 4-year-old is not the same as running with an infant. Children ask questions. Children remember. Children speak. Especially children who had started whispering words in a language that could get them both killed. I sat in that van, staring through the windshield at nothing, caught between 2 choices that both ended in damage. Stay and risk being found. Run and destroy the only stability my daughter had ever known. For the first time since the night I climbed down that fire escape, I had no answer, no plan, no next step that did not cost something I could not afford to lose. And somewhere out in a world I had spent years trying to leave behind, people were saying the word translator like it was the name of a ghost they needed to find. They just did not know yet that the ghost had a daughter. And that changed everything. Torin did not become what he was by accident. Power was not inherited in his world. It was built, piece by piece, through decisions most people would never be asked to make. He controlled 3 territories, not through violence alone, but through information. Through knowing what was moving, who was moving it, and where the fracture points lived in every operation that touched his borders. That was what made him dangerous. Demyan Korev was one of those things. The name had arrived on his desk 4 years ago, buried in a report about trafficking corridors through the eastern mountain regions. A mid-level operative inside an organization called the Seradin Group, a network so deeply embedded in the region's infrastructure that most authorities had stopped trying to dismantle it. Demyan was not important enough to draw outside attention. That was precisely what made him valuable. Because Demyan had reached out. Not directly, never directly. Through layers of intermediaries, coded channels, signals that moved slowly enough to avoid detection, but clearly enough to carry a single unmistakable meaning. He wanted out. And he was willing to bring evidence with him. The evidence he offered was extraordinary. Documents written in a dialect so rare the Seradin Group had been using it as a cipher, confident that no outsider could ever read it. They were wrong, because Demyan had access to the one person who could: his wife. Torin did not know the details of how Demyan gathered those translations. He only knew the intelligence was accurate, actionable, and arriving at a pace that suggested someone inside was taking extraordinary risks to deliver it. The arrangement was clear. Demyan would continue feeding evidence until it was comprehensive enough to bring the Seradine network down completely. When the time came, Torin's people would extract him and his family. The timeline was 18 months. They had completed 14 when everything collapsed. The Seradin Group moved faster than anyone anticipated. A leak somewhere, a single thread pulled at the wrong moment, and the walls closed without warning. Torin's extraction team deployed immediately, but they reached the apartment 40 minutes too late. Demian was dead. His wife and infant daughter were gone, vanished through a window into a city that swallowed them whole. Torin stood in that apartment afterward, looking at the blood on the floor and the photograph still hanging on the wall. The face of the man he had only ever known through intermediaries now staring back at him in a way that would never leave his memory. He had promised protection. He had not delivered it. The recording was recovered 3 weeks later from a dead drop Demian had established months before. A small device, scratched and weathered, containing a single audio file. 2 voices speaking in the same dialect the Saradin group used as their cipher. The same language Demian's wife had been translating. But something about this recording was different. One voice gave operational details, coordinates, and names. The other was quieter, more personal, carrying an intimacy that had nothing to do with evidence or intelligence. Torin played it hundreds of times over the years that followed, brought in every specialist he could find, linguists, academics, cultural researchers from the region. None of them could identify the specific dialect. Too localized, too old, too far removed from anything that existed in formal records. The recording became an open wound, not just because of what it might contain, but because of what it represented. A man who had trusted him, who had risked everything to do what was right, and whose final words remained locked in a language that no one alive seemed to speak. Until a Thursday evening, when a delivery woman set down a crate and whispered the next line before the recording finished playing it. Torin did not just hear a translator in that moment. He heard the end of a failure that had lived inside him for 3 years. And when he followed her to that apartment, and Demian's face stared back from the same photograph he had seen on a blood-stained wall years before, the final piece fell into place with a weight that nearly brought him to the floor. She was not a stranger who happened to speak a rare language. She was the woman he had been sent to save, the wife of the man he could not reach in time, the mother of the child who should have grown up under his protection. And now she was on the other side of a locked door, afraid of him, when he was the one person in this city who owed her everything. So he sat. Not because sitting was strategic or wise. He sat because standing felt like leaving, and he had already left her once without knowing it. He would not do it again. He did not stay in the hallway through the night. That would have drawn complaints, attention, interference that would force her to involve people she could not afford to involve. Instead, he left before morning and returned at dawn. She saw him from the window, across the street, leaning against the wall of the building opposite, watching her windows without approaching, not advancing, not retreating, simply there, like a stone the current could not move. He was there when she left for work. He was there when she came home. He was there when the lights in her apartment went dark, and she suspected he remained through the hours between, though she could never be sure. Leora noticed on the second day. "Mama, the man from the door is outside." "I know. He is looking at our window." "I know." "Is he still lost?" The word landed harder than it should have. "Yes," Vesna said quietly. "He is still lost." 3 days passed. He did not knock again, did not call out or leave notes or try to make contact through any channel a man with his resources could easily access. He simply remained, visible and patient, existing in her peripheral vision like a question she could not stop hearing, no matter how many times she refused to answer it. Hajna noticed on the 4th morning. She stood in the doorway of the garage, coffee in hand, watching him across the street with narrowed eyes. "Friend of yours?" "No." "He has been there since Tuesday." "I know." Hajna sipped slowly, the way she did everything, with a deliberateness that turned even small gestures into statements. Men like that do not wait unless they need something they cannot take. Vesna said nothing. Or unless they owe something they cannot pay. The words settled into her chest alongside everything else she had been carrying. Because Hajna was right. He was not acting like someone who wanted something from her. He was acting like someone who owed her, and that distinction was more disorienting than any demand could have been. On the fifth evening, Leora did something that could not be undone. While Vesna was in the kitchen, the girl climbed onto the windowsill, pressed her small hand flat against the glass, and waved. He looked up. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, he raised one hand. Not a full wave. Just an open palm, held steady, like a promise made to someone too far away to hear it spoken aloud. When Vesna came back into the room, Leora was in her usual spot, coloring, humming, as though nothing had happened. But something had, and they both knew it. That night, lying in the dark with Leora's breathing soft beside her, Vesna faced a truth she had been circling for days. He was not going to leave, and the longer he stayed, the harder it became to keep treating him like a threat, because threats do not wait. Threats do not stand in the rain without speaking. Threats do not raise an open hand when a child waves through glass. Whatever he was, whatever he wanted, it was not what she had prepared herself for. And that made it the most dangerous thing of all. She went to him on the sixth morning, not because she was ready, because waiting had become worse than knowing. He was in his usual place across the street, standing now instead of leaning, as though he had felt the shift in the air before she opened the door. The sun was barely up. The street was empty except for delivery trucks, and the distant hum of the city waking around them. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough that the distance still carried meaning. "You know who I am?" Not a question. "Yes. You knew before you knocked on my door. I knew when I saw the photograph. And the recording. The one your men have been playing for weeks. You know whose voice is on it." He was still for a moment, something shifting behind his expression in a way that told her the answer was more complicated than she expected. One of the voices? Yes. Demyan. His name in this man's mouth felt wrong, too deliberate, too familiar, like he had been saying it for years, in rooms she had never entered. "How do you know my husband?" He did not flinch. "He came to my network 4 years ago. He was inside the Saradin group, and he wanted out. He had been gathering evidence against them for months. The documents you translated at your kitchen table, the ones he brought home as work projects, those were part of it." The certainty she had carried since that night buckled quietly, like a beam giving way in a structure no one could see. "He was feeding that intelligence to my people," Torin continued. His voice was steady but stripped of authority. This was not a man giving a briefing. This was a man making a confession. The plan was extraction. When the evidence was complete, we would get him and his family out. New identities. Full relocation. What happened? They moved before we could. My team reached the apartment 40 minutes too late. Something tightened behind his eyes. Demyan was dead. You and Leora were gone. She stared at him. The street was impossibly quiet. You were supposed to protect us. Yes. And you failed. Yes. No excuse, no explanation designed to soften what he was admitting. Just 2 confirmations delivered like stones set on a scale already carrying more than it could hold. "The recording," she said, her voice thinner now, the control beginning to cost her. "What is on it?" "I do not know. No one has been able to translate it. That is why I have been searching all this time. That is why 12 specialists sat in that room and none of them could help." He paused. "And that is why a woman setting down a delivery crate and whispering a single sentence changed everything." She looked at him for a long time. The city moved around them, indifferent, the way cities always move around moments that matter most to the people inside them. "The second voice on that recording," she said slowly. "The one that is not giving instructions. The one that sounds personal. That is Demian. Yes. And he is speaking Velhari. Yes. Something cracked inside her. Not loudly, not visibly, but deep enough that she felt it in her ribs, in the place where she stored every feeling she had refused to let through since the night she climbed down a fire escape with a baby pressed against her chest. Demian had never spoken Velhari. Not once in all the years she knew him. He had listened when she spoke it to Leora. He had smiled. He had asked what certain words meant. But he had never spoken it himself. Until the end. Until he needed to say something that only she would ever be able to hear. I want to listen to it, she said. Now. They sat in the delivery van. Not his car, not his world, but hers. The space where she had spent years being no one. It felt important, though neither of them said why. He placed the device on the dashboard. Small, weathered, scratched along one edge as though it had been dropped or hidden in haste. She stared at it the way you stare at something that might reshape your life, with a stillness that is not calm, but the last moment before everything changes. He did not ask if she was ready. He pressed play. The first voice was unfamiliar. Male, sharp, speaking Velhari with a lower valley accent. Operational language. Coordinates, names, delivery schedules. The same sort of information she had once translated at her kitchen table without knowing what it meant. Her mind pulled each word apart automatically, years of buried fluency returning as though a sealed door inside her had simply opened. Then the voice changed, and everything inside her went still. Demian. His Velhari was rough, unsteady, carrying the weight of words he had practiced alone 100 times, but never spoken aloud to another person. The accent was wrong in places, the grammar fractured, the dialect of a man who had learned by listening through walls and memorizing sounds that were never meant for him. But it was Velhari, her grandmother's language, coming from the mouth of the man she had loved and buried and been angry at for 3 years. The first word he said was her name. Vesna. She stopped breathing. If you are hearing this, then what I was afraid of has already happened. And I am sorry. I am sorry for the documents I asked you to translate. I am sorry for every page I set in front of you without telling you what it carried. I am sorry for taking the one part of you that was sacred, the part your grandmother gave you, and turning it into something that served the people I was trying to destroy. Her hands locked on her knees. The van was silent except for his voice, filling the space like something that had been waiting years to reach her. I have been gathering evidence for over a year. Everything the Saradin group has built, every route, every name, every transaction, it is here. What I gave you to translate was only part of it. The rest I collected myself. I am sending it to the people I believe can use it to end this. A pause on the recording. The sound of breath being steadied. I learned your language, Vesna. Not well. You would correct me on every other word and laugh at my accent and tell me I sound like a goat trying to sing. But I learned it because I needed to say this in the only language no one else could understand. If the wrong people find this recording, only you will know what it means. Tears ran down her face. She did not wipe them. She did not move. Take Leora somewhere safe. Do not look for answers. Do not look back. Just go, and live, and tell her that her father was not the man those documents make him appear to be. Tell her I tried. That is all I need her to know. A longer pause. Something shifted in his breathing, the steadiness breaking just slightly. I loved you in every language I ever knew, and in the one I learned just so I could say it the way your grandmother would have. Then a single word, spoken softly, with the clumsy, reverent tenderness of a man who had rehearsed it alone in empty rooms until it lived inside his mouth like a prayer. Dravaya, safe place. The same word their daughter had whispered on a Wednesday afternoon while coloring on the kitchen floor. The recording ended. Silence filled the van like water rising in a space with no exits. Vesna sat motionless, tears falling freely, her breathing fractured and shallow. Beside her, Torin did not speak, did not reach for her, did not try to fill the silence with explanation or comfort or anything that might diminish what had just passed through her. He simply sat and let the weight of a dead man's love occupy the space between them. And for the first time since the night she climbed down a fire escape with her daughter in her arms, Vesna grieved. Not the version of Demian she had been running from, not the man who had used her gift without her knowledge, but the man who had learned her language in secret, who had practiced it alone in rooms she would never see, so that his last words on this earth could reach the only person they were ever meant for. She did not speak for a long time after the recording ended. When she finally opened the door of the van and stepped out, the morning had passed, replaced by a light that was softer and less certain. Torin did not follow. He waited, the way he had been waiting since the first night, letting the distance be whatever she needed it to be. She went inside, made tea, sat at the kitchen table where she had once translated documents without knowing their weight, and let the truth rearrange everything she had carried since the night she left. Demian had not simply used her. He had used her and then tried to undo it, dismantling the machine from inside, one piece of evidence at a time. The translation she gave him went in two directions, into the Saradan group's operations and into a case meant to end them. He had been fighting a war on both sides that only one side knew was being waged, and he had lost. But not before recording his evidence and his goodbye in a language he taught himself in secret, because it was the only cipher that no one could break except the woman he loved. The anger did not disappear. Years of surviving on its fuel could not evaporate because a dead man spoke tender words in her grandmother's tongue. But the direction of it shifted, pulling away from the photograph on the wall and turning towards something larger and more real, the network that killed him, the organization still hunting her, and the man outside who had been sent to save them and had not arrived in time. She opened the door that evening, not wide, not as an invitation, just enough to speak through. Leora wants to give you bread. He looked up from across the street. Rain had started again, thin and steady. She has been asking every day since you arrived. He stood slowly. Tell her thank you. Tell her yourself. He crossed the street without hesitation, stopping at the building entrance, close enough now that the distance between them was no longer a barrier, but a choice. It was not forgiveness. They both understood that. It was a door opened by the width of a child's persistence and a dead man's final word, and it was everything either of them could manage right now. Leora appeared behind her mother, holding a piece of bread wrapped in a napkin, her eyes wide and serious. She stepped forward, stopped in front of him, and held it up. You looked hungry, she said simply. He knelt, the way a man kneels when something small and sacred is being offered, and took it from her hands. Thank you, Leora. Her eyes narrowed. How do you know my name? Someone told me about you a long time ago. Someone who wanted you to be safe. She turned that over in the measured way she examined everything. Then she nodded, as though the answer met a standard only she understood. She walked back to her mother, took her hand, and pulled her inside without another word. The door closed. But this time, the lock did not turn. It did not happen the way stories suggest it should. There was no single moment of resolution, no conversation that repaired everything at once, no embrace that erased years of distance in a breath. It happened the way real things happen. Slowly, through ordinary mornings and quiet routines, and the steady accumulation of moments too small to notice, until you look back and realize they were holding everything together. Torin found a place 2 blocks from their building, stripped of everything that connected him to the empire waiting across the city. He walked Leora to school in the mornings while Vesna drove her routes, and he was there when the day ended, sitting at the kitchen table as though that was where he had always belonged. Leora claimed him fearlessly and completely, the way she claimed everything in her life. She talked without stopping, showed him drawings, asked questions that had no simple answers and refused to accept the ones that were too easy. He answered all of them with the steady patience of a man learning how to be present in a way no one had ever taught him. Vesna watched. She measured. She kept the distance her body still needed even as her mind began to trust the shape of what was forming around them. The recording was delivered to the right people. Not through force, not through the channels of power Torin could have used, but through the precise path Demyan had originally intended. The evidence, fully translated, was comprehensive enough to dismantle the Saradin group from its foundations upward. It took months. It happened quietly. And when it was over, the world that had been hunting the translator simply ceased to exist. Vesna did not leave the courier service. She did not abandon the van or the routes or the life she had built with her own hands. But she began to teach. One student at first, then a few more. The old tongue of the Velhari Ridge, spoken aloud for the first time in years without fear of who might hear it. Leora learned it properly, not from whispered fragments absorbed in the dark, but from her mother's voice in the daylight, steady and unafraid. And one afternoon, sitting in the small kitchen while Leora practiced words at the table and Torin stood at the counter making tea he had only recently learned to prepare, Vesna heard her daughter say a word she recognized. Dravaya. Leora looked up, smiling. That is my favorite one, Mama. Vesna closed her eyes. When she opened them, Torin was watching her. Quiet. Still. Carrying the same expression he had worn since the first night in the hallway. The look of a man who understood that some debts are not repaid in a single act, but in the steady, patient work of showing up, again and again, for as long as it takes. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. She reached across the table, placed her hand over his, and let it rest there. And for the first time since a language meant to protect her had nearly destroyed everything she loved, the word felt true. Dravaya, safe place, not a memory, not a whisper hidden in the dark, not a dead man's farewell carried on a scratched recording across years of silence. A life, built from what remained, and strong enough, finally, to hold.